Hi, everybody. Let's go over the components of what makes for a strong original advocacy topic. It's really important to think about topics as not just being one thing and not just being abstractly good or bad, but having a number of components that, if you can stack as many of these together as possible, end up being really successful. I'm going to go through each of these 6 components: the pervasive harms that make an audience care, systemic root causes, the unexpected angle, authentic personal investment, visceral storytelling, and then timeliness and relevance, to hopefully give you a much better understanding of what a strong original advocacy topic is. Let's start with the first one. This is definitely the most important: pervasive harms that make your audience care. This is the foundation of any good original oratory. At its heart, original advocacy is about proving to your audience that your problem is a serious issue with real negative consequences that your audience should care about. So the first part of this is definitely about establishing severity. And so you definitely want to write this down in your notes. What does it mean to establish severity? That means that you need to prove that this isn't just some minor problem. I've had students present topics to me like planned obsolescence. And I'm like, well, what is the severity here? Like, who is being hurt by this? How many lives are being ruined due to this? How does this harm eventually impact everybody else in the room? What are the powerful statistics or moving stories that make this harm feel real and urgent? If you can't answer those questions, that means that you probably don't have a serious topic. And so planned obsolescence, the idea that, like your iPhone, maybe after 3 years, it'll start to not work very well, or like the battery will start to die. That's annoying, and it's like frustrating that companies do that, but that's not really ruining lives in the way that other original advocacies are identifying topics that really do. Think about the topic about high insulin prices. If somebody who is diabetic cannot get access to insulin, that obviously has detrimental effects for their lives and obviously puts their lives in jeopardy. I think a couple of different ways to think about severity is you can think of it as different levels. There's the individual level. So that could be concrete suffering or loss of individuals. There's systemic, so that is ripple effects on institutions or the economy or the culture as a whole. In general, I think your effect will probably be on individuals. And then you can also think about the future as well, right? What is the escalation if this problem continues to be ignored? And those are levels that you can kind of operate on. Now, the next level, after establishing severity, and you want to make sure, again, you have a problem that is actually ruining lives. I think that's the easiest way to think about severity. And the inverse of that, if you're not doing this well, you just have a problem that doesn't really seem like it has any real substantial effect on society. Next is making sure that your audience cares by evoking a sense of moral urgency. And there's a couple of different ways to do this, but at the end of the day, you need your audience to sit there and feel that the topic is what I would call ethically undeniable, something that we have to act on, not just something that would be like nice to have or that seems like a minor problem, something like that. So the question you want to ask is like, what's the moral truth at the heart of this issue? Why would doing nothing feel unacceptable? And there's a couple different ways to generate this sense of moral urgency. You can show the problem affects everybody in the room, so like the audience themselves, like this is a huge issue that we should all be concerned about. You could show that the problem disproportionately affects a marginalized group, usually one that you're a part of. And I've seen that work very well in different speeches before, in a way that generates moral outrage from the audience. You can also show a different one of our categories is going to be about personal connection, so I'll save that. But another one is just exposing contradictions between our values as Americans. So that could be like freedom, opportunity, safety, individuality, fairness, and America's reality. And so I think there's a sense of comparative shame that you can evoke of just like, how does America lag behind peer nations on our own shared values or stated values? And then a good test is like, as Americans, we believe in X, but actually our system Y. So those are all ways of generating a sense of moral urgency. And so you can think about it. I've seen topics that do a good job of getting the audience to care by showing how large a problem is and how it probably can affect everybody in the room. I've seen topics really work that affect very narrow groups of people, but it just cuts against, well, first, it disproportionately affects a marginalized group to such a horrifying extent, and it cuts against our core values as Americans that we can't help but be moved. One successful topic like this was on kidney transplants, and it was about the algorithm that is used to determine who gets a kidney when somebody is in need of a kidney transplant. And what was really interesting about this is that the algorithm that's used to determine eligibility, because obviously there aren't enough kidneys for everybody that needs a transplant, explicitly has a category in it that's based on outdated early 20th century pseudoscience that's explicitly racist against black people. Like there's no utility of this category in the algorithm. It literally is just a remnant of pseudoscience that hasn't been scrubbed from the algorithm and ends up disproportionately affecting black people in America who are in need of a new kidney and leads to like 85%, I forget what the statistic was, some huge statistic about African Americans not getting kidney transplants. So it's just like, yeah, is everybody in your audience going to be a black individual who needs a new kidney? No. But are they going to feel such a sense of moral outrage by this that they'll be moved by it? Absolutely. And so that's a delicate balance there, because some topics, like for instance, topics that affect countries that are very far away from America rarely work. In general, in original advocacy, you are going to be having, actually always in original advocacy, your solution needs to be something that is rooted in US federal government action. And just the way that people work, as sad as it is they care more about problems that are closer to home and that affect people in their own country than problems that are far off. So that is just one set of problems that you're not going to want to try to address as like some problem that is really far away. It's just a lot harder to get the audience to care about that than something that is close and at home and feels like it's affecting us here in America. Next is systemic root causes. And this is one of the biggest issues that I think original advocates really mess up on. So let's really focus on this and make sure to take good notes. Your topic and its harms need to have a specific root cause due to policy or governmental failures that a federal government solution would be able to solve. That's a mouthful. Let's break this down. I think a root cause focus is about identifying systems and policies that create problems or failures of policy. So you need to identify a specific narrowly defined problem. I call this the Goldilocks zone. That is a symptom of a larger systemic failure. So just standing up and being like, there's poverty in America is not a systemic root cause, right? Poverty is a harm or an impact. And way too many original advocates start from a place of just thinking about impacts. If I want to talk about gun violence, I want to talk about, or like gun deaths, I want to talk about poverty, I want to talk about climate change. And none of those are really topics. Those are all impacts. A topic in original advocacy is a specific system or set of policies or failures that are leading to those harms that you're talking about. So again, OA is not a speech about problems. It's about policies that fix systems. And so the question you want to ask is, what is the structural cause, so a law, policy, or system, of this problem? And once you start getting specific about the systemic root causes, your original advocacy not only becomes a lot more interesting, you also set up the solution to your problem, which is what you're going to have to build to. Ultimately, again, in original advocacy, you need to present a plan that is a federal government, U.S. federal government policy that would address your problem. And when original advocates just stand up and talk about problems and harms, if they just talk about like wide-ranging impacts for 7 minutes, and then they say like, here are all the impacts of poverty, and then they stand up and say, and here's a plan to fix it, it'll feel just like a magic wand that comes out of nowhere. It'll feel really shallow. As opposed to if you're identifying systemic harms, it'll be a lot better. So what are the two mistakes I see novices make? One is they're like blaming individuals, framing the issue as people's bad choices. So this would be like teenagers are addicted to their phones, or people have gotten themselves into too much debt, or people are obese because they eat too much food, or students are failing school because they don't study enough and rely on AI to do their homework. Notice these are all sounding a little bit more like they should belong in an original oratory, something like about a problematic mindset. A government solution isn't going to change how people eat or like how students study at home. And then the other problem, which I've already been talking about, and this is the biggest one, like this is the biggest way original advocates mess up, is they just have a harms-only description. They're just listing impacts without identifying the structural root cause. And you can see all the examples here, just like homelessness is rising, educational inequality creates a huge achievement gap, poverty leaves millions of Americans without healthcare. None of those answer the question, why is this happening, right? What's broken in the system that produces the harm? And so you should think of your job as an original advocate. Like it's okay to start in your own research with a problem that you care a lot about, but you need to dig deep into finding the specific root cause that's linked to some sort of system or policy that could be targeted with government action. So none of those leave room for a meaningful federal solution, like none of these examples. Again, the best original advocacy is diagnose the system creating the problem and prescribe a policy fix. So you want to identify the structures, policies, or incentives that create the harm. So don't say people are obese because they eat poorly. Say federal food subsidies make processed corn products cheaper than vegetables, shaping what's affordable. That's a really interesting point of just like if you make processed corn products, which becomes the heart of all corn syrup, like most of the artificial sugar we eat, and if government policies are subsidizing that corn syrup to make it artificially super cheap so that it ends up everywhere, that's an interesting policy and problem to talk about. That's a topic. Or don't just say students fail because schools are unequal. Say property tax based funding locks poor districts into permanent underfunding. That is more interesting. Now, I actually don't think this topic would make for a great regional advocacy for other reasons that these other criteria will cover. But notice I'm trying to show you how to move from a problem-based or harm-based approach to OA to a root cause, a systemic root cause-based way of thinking about it. Instead of just doctors burn out because they work hard, it would move to federal reimbursement rules and EHR requirements trap doctors in hours of administrative labor. So you always want to think about addressing the deeper root cause of the problem. And you want to make sure that it's structural so that there's a policy change that the federal government can actually enact. So again, if you just note harm's only phrasing, just like millions of people suffer from X, this is devastating, this leads to, that means you probably don't have a good root cause. Instead, you want to shift it to systemic phrasing, like this harm exists because current law requires, or because federal government incentivizes, or because funding structures block. That's the type of language that shows me that you're actually thinking about addressing systemic causes. And so that will help your OA get to what I like to call the Goldilocks zone of specificity, where your topic is narrow enough to be fully explored in a 10-minute speech, but broad enough to have national significance. Again, just standing up and saying our healthcare system is broken or like patients are dying because of bad healthcare, way too broad, way too harms focused. Getting to this specific issue of doctor burnout due to federal reimbursement rules and these EHR requirements is a much more interesting and narrow articulation of this topic that still leads to impacts of patients having detrimental outcomes without just making this huge, broad, nebulous thing. So that's definitely, I would say that's the one that students mess up on the most. And if you can address that, you'll have a much more interesting original advocacy. Third, unexpected angle. Your topic ideally should offer a fresh perspective that's surprising or unexpected for your audience. So you don't just want to identify a problem, you want to change how your audience thinks about it. This is like the unexpected category made to stick. Your audience should walk away saying, wow, I never thought about it that way before. And so this is why you need to avoid at all costs. Let's jump down here real quick. Overdone topics. And this is, I see so many students go into original advocacy because you want to talk some big, very cliche or very well discussed political issue like climate change or abortion or gun control. And while that's admirable, it's ultimately not going to grip your audience. Those topics are so well trodden that it's just hard to say something new. And your audience is probably either already going to agree with you on face and already know everything about it, so they're just going to tune out and be bored, or they're just going to vehemently disagree with you because these are very politicized issues. And that's not good either, right? Getting into a topic like doctors being overworked because of burdensome requirements on a federal government level is not something that's like heavily politicized. And it makes for a very interesting topic regardless of the audience. But standing up and talking about gun control is too well known. Everybody has an opinion. It's too politicized, etc. So let's jump back up here. Here's some ways to find an unexpected, surprising, or nuanced topic. First, you could reframe a familiar issue. So take a problem people know and reveal a surprising consequence. So you could say most people think X is a minor inconvenience or isn't a huge problem or something like that, but it actually causes Y. This is interesting. There was a speech years ago about tort law. This is like personal injury law. It's like most people think personal injury law is something that you do if you like spill the super hot McDonald's coffee on yourself and you want to sue, but actually it drives up healthcare costs. And this speech was a really interesting exploration of the way in which personal injury law unintentionally ends up being a huge reason why insurance companies and healthcare costs ends up spiraling out of control. Next, another way is we assume X only affects a small group, but in reality, it affects Y. A second way they can go about this is identifying a hidden root cause. So you can show the real engine of a problem is something that most people overlook. So it's like people recognize X is a problem, but don't realize Y is the structural cause. Now, obviously, this is a little clunky. You wouldn't articulate it exactly like this in your speech, but I think conceptually, these are useful frameworks. Another one is this harm doesn't come from where you think. It's driven by X. So again, this kind of like, let's reshape the way that we think about a problem. Third is revealing an overlooked issue entirely. This is like the kidney algorithm one. Introduce a problem that the audience doesn't even know exists. So like no one's talking about X, yet it leads to Y. Like nobody knows the kidney algorithm problem is leading to is based on early 20th century pseudoscience, but it leads to Black people disproportionately not getting kidneys. Or behind every blank statistic is an overlooked factor. Why? Those are kind of templates or conceptual frameworks for you to think about. Another problem I often see is this predictable framing issue where it's just like school is stressful or mental health issues need to be addressed or we need to recycle more, care more about the environment. All those are predictable surface level takes that don't get us to rethink the issue. Like if ultimately the audience is going to be sitting there being like, yep, like obviously pollution is bad or this thing is bad, like obviously this is problematic, and I'm not like, oh wow, I didn't even know this is an issue, or oh wow, this is really interesting, then that's I'm just going to start tuning out, right? So you want to make sure that most people in the audience wouldn't already know your thesis or know your topic or already like agree with your take before you even open your mouth. And you want to make the ideal is when you explain the cause of your harm, do people think like, wow, I never realized that? Those are the best topics. Think of like John Oliver does some really good segments on it, or at least he used to, where he would like pick a topic that people don't know a lot about, show a surprising root cause of it, and then really explore its implications. And the goal of that, like think of how interesting those were. You were like, oh wow, like I had no idea that this led to X, Y, and Z horrific negative outcome. And that was super interesting. Now I know more about the world. That's what an original advocacy should make us feel. Fourth, authentic personal connection or investment. This has become increasingly important as time goes on. And I think the more that you have an authentic personal reason for giving your speech, the better. It's just like your connection to the topic is the greatest source of credibility and emotional power you have. And so the ideal is your judges or your audience doesn't just remember your topic. They remember you as a speaker, as a person who gave life or whose life gave that topic urgency. And so you want to ask yourself, right, why am I the right person to advocate for this issue? Is this topic rooted in my family, my community, my culture, my identity, or a deep personal passion? What personal story can I share that shows the audience that this isn't just a research project or just like something where I'm checking boxes for me? That really helps. And some reasons why it matters, it obviously garners more credibility or ethos. They're more likely to believe you if you clearly have skin in the game. It creates more emotional resonance or pathos. So a personal time makes the stakes real. It shows that you aren't just presenting a problem, you're living inside it. And it gives like some uniqueness, right? Like anyone can Google any of these problems, but only you can talk about like here's the example I have here. Anybody can Google statistics on physician burnout, but only you can talk about seeing your dad collapse from overwork. Or another topic was growing up bilingual in a Title I program. Like if you have these unique experiences, that's what sets your speech apart from 30 others in a tournament or from other people just speaking out in the world. Here's some traps I see of weak personal connection or investment. First is vague interest. You're just like, I care about poverty because I think poverty is bad. Like, obviously, so does everybody. I would hope everybody does. That's not very personal. Second is a secondhand connection. So this is like my friend's cousin once. And it's like, dude, that's too distant. That doesn't really feel authentic. It doesn't really feel like it's affected you in a personal way. Another one is an afterthought story, like throwing in a shallow anecdote just to check the box on personal connection. And I think audiences see right through these. If another student could give the exact same speech, the personal interest isn't strong enough. So instead, here's some tips about how to create a stronger personal connection. First, think about your family connection. I've seen this work, or just like your own personal connection. Like, what did you grow up with? What was your family like? Those are good examples. Second is a community connection. So like a local school program you were a part of, or like some after school program or a co-curricular, something like that, or like volunteer work you've done. And I really urge my original advocates, like the more advocacy work that you actually do in the world, the more that you'll have to say. I had students who went and started doing actual work with the Ohlone indigenous tribe of San Jose, and they got very involved with city advocacy issues here. And it's like, if you're doing that type of work, then you'll have a lot of meaningful things to say. Whereas if you don't get involved with anything, like if you don't actually care about advocacy in the world, it's going to be really hard for you to find a genuine personal connection. Third is identity or culture. So an example of this would be like being part of an immigrant family makes you uniquely positioned to talk about language policy, or experiencing racial or gender bias gives you lived credibility to talk about systemic discrimination. Now, obviously, you need to make sure that your speech isn't like people are racist, because like how would government policy solve that? But hopefully think about your identity as a way to create a personal connection, and also a deep personal passion. Like if you've been researching climate law for years or interning in public health, that passion could count. If you've been volunteering in hospitals for like hundreds of hours, that could count. But it has to be real. It can't be like, wow, I read this one article and now I say it's my passion. Like that obviously doesn't work. Fifth, visceral storytelling. The issue should allow you to tell very real human stories, like real people affected, not just statistics. It's really easy for original advocacy to get very dry and boring very fast. So the more that you can incorporate stories, the more you'll get your audience to care. Like stats prove that your harms are not an isolated case, but ultimately stories bring it to life and make me care. So what are stories of real people who've experienced this problem that make that problem unforgettable, who puts a face on this issue? And you're typically going to build to this as kind of the climax of your speech before your solvency or your solution. And so at the end of the day, right, like facts persuade the mind, but stories persuade the heart. A story is ultimately going to move the audience emotionally. Stories make abstract harms concrete. Like if you just say doctors feel burned out, that feels too abstract. But if you're like Dr. Lorna Breen, a beloved aunt and salsa dancer, worked until she collapsed, then took her own life, like that's unforgettable. And really think about the hormones that Phillips was talking about in the TED Talk that I had you all watch, and thinking about utilizing stories that are going to move in an audience and activate those different hormonal responses is really, really important for creating a compelling speech that moves us. Third, like stories just humanize the scale. If you're just giving us huge statistics like 1 million people, that's just a number. And unfortunately, we become very numb to statistics and numbers. But one vivid story is a person that the judge can imagine and care about. And then here's what visceral storytelling looks like. You want to make sure to have human faces, so put a name and identity on them. Instead of immigrants live in fear, tell the story of a mother who couldn't open her door for weeks because she was terrified of deportation. Right? That simple shift really helps to contextualize. And you still need the stats. You need to show it's not isolated. But if you only have stats without human stories, that's going to be bad. Second, you want to give it concrete sensory details. So tiny sensory details make the story stick. Like, she hadn't slept in a week. He left home without telling his family if he'd return. She drove a convertible and taught her nieces salsa. Like, all those details make the story feel real rather than like a prop. Third, you want to develop the story. So many novices I see include a story but don't develop it. They'll be like, a doctor named John Doe committed suicide. That shows how bad burnout is. That like doesn't make us feel anything. Whereas if you say Dr. Breen snowboarded, salsa danced, and drove a convertible. But during COVID, she worked 12-hour shifts without supplies, sat paralyzed in her chair, and feared losing her license if she sought help. Weeks later, she was gone. Like that's so much better. So the difference is depth and visceral resonance. So you always want to add that depth. Fourth is emotional contrast. You want to show what was lost. For the Dr. Breen example we've been going over, the contrast was between being the cool aunt and being crushed by a system. And that shift makes the tragedy land a lot harder. Again, you don't want to feel like you're hamming this up in a way that feels inauthentic or that you're like doing it way too much. But again, if you deploy this strategically, that can really help to bring your story to life. And finally, this is kind of like a bonus category, but I think it helps so much to make you stand out, is adding timeliness and relevance to your topic. So your arguments should be supported by credible, up-to-date evidence that shows that the problem is real and relevant right now. I think the best OAers infuse their speech with a sense of timeliness. So the problem isn't just a chronic issue. It's a crisis that demands our attention right now because of recent events, emerging trends, or new data. So you should ask, like, would this speech feel just as urgent 5 years ago? If so, what recent events, studies, or cultural shifts can I add to prove why we must act today? And I remember I was working with one of my students who ended up being a state finalist who gave a speech on the importance of bilingual education. And this was a very unconventional original advocacy because lives weren't really being ruined, but he had a really strong personal connection as he had gone through a bilingual education and experienced so much. But we realized the relevance of this. This speech was given in 2025, and the relevance of that topic being in 2025, a time where America feels so divided, where everything feels so divisive, where people feel like they're like the bridges between us in this country feel like they're being torn apart as opposed to built. A speech that ultimately built to a conclusion about bilingualism is not just being good because it has all these cognitive benefits, because it helps you developmentally, it helps you academically and intellectually. Like there were so many good scientific benefits about how an early bilingual education really helps children and how America not doing that ends up like leading to all these developmental harms of just like children could be so much better prepared intellectually and developmentally. But he also built to a kind of conclusion of like, this is a way for us to bridge the differences between so many cultures. And he shared a really moving story about like how much he learned getting to become or becoming fluent in Spanish and learning so much about the culture of other people in San Jose that he wouldn't have otherwise been exposed to if he never got to speak their language. And so that was like a very good way of adding timeliness and relevance without it feeling forced. So examples of weak relevance, obviously, if you just say poverty is bad and we should reduce it, that's like true in any year, right? Like there's nothing urgent there. Or educational inequality harms students. Sure, but what's new here? Or climate change threatens our planet. Like, yeah, that's important and it probably is urgent. But if you don't tie it to current developments, it just sounds recycled. It sounds well trodden. Like everybody's talked about this issue. So here's what you want to do to make your topic feel relevant. You obviously want recent data, recent sources, and you really want to leverage current events. I think the second one is the most important, like second and third, of leverage current events, connect it to something in the headlines, or third, like identify emerging trends. Frame your issue as accelerating or changing right now, or tapping into what's going on culturally. And then fourth and finally, frame it as a crisis window. That like delay makes the problem exponentially worse, and now is the time to act. So that was a mouthful. I know that it feels really overwhelming when you just get all of these components and it's like, all right, find a topic that meets all of these. Know that this is an iterative loop of you'll probably do some research. You might go down some rabbit holes. You might find that your topic is fulfilling a few of these, but is not quite fulfilling enough. And again, not every topic necessarily needs all 6 of these, but I will say the topics that get all 6 of these feel the best. Again, like if you can access all of these components and the more that you can stack them, the stronger your topic becomes and the more it stands out and the less cliche it becomes. But I would definitely say that the biggest ones are making sure you have pervasive harms, making sure that you're addressing systemic root causes, making sure that there's something unexpected here. And then if you're trying to be a super serious competitor, I would say these next 3 are the next most important ones. So authentic personal connection, visceral storytelling, and then timeliness and relevance. Like, while those aren't necessarily core to like a novice's understanding of original advocacy, I really want to push everybody to get there because that's what's going to make you really stand out and make your speech very, very memorable. But at the very least, the first 3 are like non-negotiable. You got to find a unique angle and you got to make sure that you're addressing systemic root causes. So hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully this is helpful for getting you a deeper understanding of original advocacy. I can't wait to see what speeches you all put together.